Hi everybody, Bearded Rogue here, and today on Vlogust, what's the second to last day of Vlogust, I decided that I wanted to talk about wrestling again, since I haven't done that in a while. And specifically I wanted to talk about the smaller, some of the smaller promotions that are out there. And one of the smaller promotions that's part of a much bigger promotion. So, I've been a fan of wrestling since forever. If you watched the Roddy Piper video earlier in this series, or the video about the Monday Night Wars game that I'm currently working on, then you probably picked that up. But right now is a very exciting time in wrestling after a very long, stale period. When WCW folded, and after ECW folded, WWE was kind of the only game in town. And anytime there's only one group putting out something, they aren't forced to compete. And not having to compete creates a lot of pacifism and a lot of stale and tired product, particularly in media world. You know, the WWE kind of was able to sit back on its laurels and go, you know what, we won. There's nobody else. Nobody can challenge us or what we're doing, so we'll just, you know, keep putting out product, and it doesn't really matter what the quality is. Or they were, you know, patting themselves on the back and were like, yay, we did it, so we can just keep doing the same thing we were doing, and everything will be happy with it. And that's not really the case. So the first thing I want to talk about is NXT. And NXT is part of the WWE, so you're like, what do you mean? This isn't a small promotion. Well, NXT is a much smaller roster. It's the developmental territory for the WWE. And NXT has been an experiment of Triple H's. He took their previous developmental brand, FCW, and after they tried to turn it into a ridiculous variety show with some reality elements thrown in, they decided to go ahead and just turn it into a straight-up wrestling show, an hour of wrestling. And I think the keys to having a successful promotion, or a promotion that wrestling fans are into, is, number one, have an hour-long show. The reason this is important is because in an hour-long show, there's not a lot of time to fill it with crap. Most wrestling fans tune in for wrestling. I also happen to like storylines. However, the kind of storytelling that takes place in NXT is storytelling that takes place inside the ring. And by storytelling inside the ring, I don't mean one guy stands in the ring for half an hour with a microphone and talks to everybody about what the storyline is up to this point so they can tune in whatever week they want to. I mean that in the ring, these two guys are fighting. You know why they're fighting. They've ran into each other in previous bouts, or they've fought each other, or this is the first time they're fighting, or they're fighting over the title, or there's some legitimate reason why they're fighting. Like, boxing matches and UFC matches create the same kinds of stories. Why are these people fighting? What's the drama around these people fighting? Well, it's has to do with their actual career in the ring, or things that they've said to each other back and forth on social media. It doesn't have to do with one guy pontificating in the ring for half an hour, or one person, you know, jumping another during a backstage segment, although that can be used. It seems like the main shows have really lost their way in terms of storytelling in the ring. You know, the babyface who gets beaten up through the entire match and then comes back at the end to defeat the hateful heel who's been, you know, mugging for the crowd and making everybody angry. Or, you know, Kevin Owens is a perfect example. Why is Kevin Owens succeeding on the main roster? First of all, because he's an amazing talent and he would probably succeed anywhere he goes. But second of all, because he spends time actually, like, doing things that make you dislike him. As a wrestling fan, I like heels. I like traditional heels, those that try to garner heat. And Kevin Owens is a master at it, from, you know, throwing out small quips like wrestling Rusev and asking him to lose some weight, or, jaw-jacking at the announce staff, showing up unexpectedly whenever somebody's talking about him in an interview just to give them a hard time, even if it's not necessarily to throw fists, just to be there and make them uncomfortable about talking about him, or doing crazy things like throwing announcers over the announce table when he doesn't like the kind of tone that they're taking with him, or, in one instance, sitting at the announce table with them and asking them about why they weren't asking him questions since he was the champ, and then, not 5 minutes later, berating them for asking him questions and not doing their job and calling the action in the ring. All tried and true heel style tactics, but they fit inside of the hour-long show. Like, Kevin Owens did all of this while a match was going on that was telling another story. The resurgence of the Divas division, or the women's division, as everybody who's right-thinking would like to refer to it, is primarily because of NXT, because it's an hour-long show, because they have 3 matches, basically, and they gave the women just as much time as the men to have a match, like an actual match, and they built all of these storylines, the young up-and-comer Bayley, who can never win the big one, or Sasha Banks, who's the devious mean girl who will go to any lengths to cheat and ally herself with people in order to try to get herself to the top, or Charlotte, who was just absolutely dominant and put on match of the night after match of the night after match of the night with every opponent, like making everybody look as good as she was, even if she was winning. And a lot of these same principles carry over, I'm going to mention another one now, to shows like Lucha Underground. Now, Lucha Underground and NXT are very different. They're different in tone, they're different in scope. NXT is very much a developmental system. Like, you will see a lot of superstars there who haven't quite reached their peak. Like, superstars who are still on the upswing, who are still working out how they are going to talk on the mic, who their character is, still working on ring fundamentals depending on how they came into the sport. So you have a very different dynamic in NXT. Lucha Underground is filled with some amazing talents who never really got to shine as brightly as they should have in the larger venues, specifically Alberto Del Rio, now Alberto El Patron, and Johnny Mundo, formerly John Morrison. 2 phenomenal wrestlers, phenomenal talents, who've only gotten better, and once they were allowed to have a little bit of creative freedom with their characters, were able to put on some of the most amazing matches and put in some of the most amazing rivalry work I've ever seen. I'm really high on Lucha Underground right now. I just recently watched it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Find it. It has some of the best matches anywhere. It is primarily Lucha Libre style, but they have wrestlers of all types. It is a very different dynamic. WWE has the very traditional American heel and babyface dynamic, where the heel is supposed to work on making the fans upset at them, and the babyface is supposed to work on making the fans cheer them. The heel does bad things, the babyface does good things. That's primarily their dynamic. Usually the babyface gets beaten up over and over and over again until finally they overcome the heel in this great, amazing comeback story. This formula works, and it's fairly tried and true. It's kind of been run into the ground with some characters like John Cena, who has no business being the underdog babyface ever again since he has beaten everybody. I mean, literally everybody. There's nothing for him to do anymore in that role, but that's an entire aside. In Lucha Libre, they have the Rudo and the Technico. And the Rudo is the bad guy who cheats and steals and lies and does bad things and focuses much more on violence and hardcore and, doing things that are dangerous or at least look dangerous to his opponent. Whereas the Technico is all about the technical style of wrestling, like the high-flying, the impressive moves, the really sharp, smooth aspect of wrestling. And it reminds me a lot of ECW back in the day, where you had, C.W. Anderson and Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero and guys who were, like, amazing technical wizards. And then you had, Balls Mahoney and the Sandman and people who had absolutely no technical mastery but were able to be exquisite purveyors of violence. Lucha Libre is like that in a lot of ways. And Lucha Underground really captures that. And it's a very different dynamic, because you'll end up cheering for both depending on what it is that you personally like. If you're a more bloodthirsty hardcore fan, you may be cheering the bad guys. If you're a, appreciator of fine technical wrestling, then you may be cheering all the technicos. But again, it's an hour-long show. Lucha Underground does something very different with its promos. Instead of having promos in the ring, they actually have vignettes, like taped, recorded vignettes, like movies, in between their matches. And all of these are like backdoor segments in the boss's office, where they go over, various deals and things that are happening behind the scenes, or you'll get a cutaway to, somebody who's going to be coming soon, training in the background, and, various things like that. But they're shot like movies, rather than like live-action reality like television. So it adds a really slick aspect to the production, because they cut back and forth between these backstage vignettes and then these matches, which are some of the most amazing matches I've ever seen. If you can't see all of Lucha Underground, you need to see their Ultima Lucha special, which is their last 3 episodes, 38, 39, and 40. Because Ultima Lucha is some of the best wrestling I have ever seen anywhere. They have, crazy matches, Falls Count Anywhere matches. They have a Cero Miedo match, which is No Fear, that features a guy named Pentagon Jr., who they built up over the course of the season, and Vampiro, who was a star who hasn't wrestled in a while, who came back for this one match, and they put on an absolutely mind-blowing display. That's not to mention Alberto Del Rio, or Alberto El Patron, and Johnny Mundo, Johnny Morrison, put on an amazing technical display, with some real malice behind it in their feud, and just, like, every match from start to finish. This kid that they have, Prince Puma, who was their champion, pulls off some moves I have never in my life seen. He wrestles as Ricochet elsewhere in other promotions, but they just have this mix of old and new talent, all of whom are kind of like hitting their stride or in their prime, and it's an hour-long show. So again, they have 3 matches, and then they have the little vignettes in between kind of tying everything together, and the vignettes aren't long. The vignettes, like, I think the longest one is 5 minutes. It's not 30 minutes of somebody in the ring yakking away. WWE has 4 hours or 3 hours. They have 5 hours of television now. 3 hours of Raw and 2 hours of SmackDown for 5 hours total. And that's not to mention other things like Superstars and stuff. So there's this bloat to it, where they're putting more and more and more into the shows in order to try to fill out the time that they have, because they need the advertising money that comes from the commercials that run during those shows. But I almost think that they would be better off, like, separating it into 3 one-hour shows. Even if they wanted to show them all back-to-back, like, segmenting it out, and having the storylines carry through from one show to another. Just an hour seems to be enough to have 3 matches and further multiple plot lines. Because in the between segments of Lucha Underground, they're typically setting up next week, their next episode, rather than focusing on the one that's currently going on. So it also gives you some reason to tune in next week, because now you're really excited, because you know that these guys made this deal for this really great match that's going to take place next week, and you can't wait to see it. And it just, the technical wizardry that they display in the ring really sells it. But they did an effective job of promoting all of these wrestlers, a lot of whom are not even known in the American stage. So I really do think that an hour-long program, I think focusing on storytelling in the ring, or with short segments in between matches, or even during matches, like the Kevin Owens sitting at the announce table, are much more effective than a lot of the things that the larger WWE promotion is using. This is already 14 minutes. As you can tell, I'm really passionate about this subject. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that, you know, AAA down in Mexico, Ring of Honor, there's a few others like New Japan Pro Wrestling or Wrestling Noah. There's all sorts of new promotions and older promotions that are just now making their way to television in the States that are worth watching. And I really think we're starting to reach an international point where it's an international competition now. It's not just WWE rules the roost. Like, all of these smaller promotions are in a lot of ways offering a better product than the bloated, slow WWE product. Like, and that's not to take away anything from any of the wrestlers in the WWE. Like, all of them are working their ass off. It's not their fault that things have gotten the way they are. If anything, creative is to blame. But even they're handcuffed to some extent by what they can do because of all of their setups. Also, one thing I'll say about Lucha Underground is it is an adult wrestling show. It's not quite as bad as ECW used to be back in the day, but it is definitely a more adult show. There is swearing, there is blood, there is weapons. It's a much more adult show. I guess Season 2 may be picked up by Netflix, which would be amazing. Right now it was on the El Rey Network, which is Robert Rodriguez's network. Robert Rodriguez, of course, from Desperado and Planet Terror and El Mariachi and all of that kind of stuff, Sin City. They were on that network, and they kind of exploded online, and now there's a chance that they may be picked up by Netflix or somewhere else and actually take off even further than they have. Like, it's legitimately that good. I highly recommend at least watching Ultima Lucha. And there's all sorts of Ring of Honor shows you should watch. Like, if you can get Ring of Honor in your area, you should watch it every week. I'm not going to talk about anything else in depth, because this is already a really long video, and it's my second to last one for the month of Vlogust, but just know that there's a lot of really great wrestling out there if the WWE isn't currently satisfying you. And if the WWE is currently satisfying you, I would still check this out, because a lot of these guys are going to be the main players going forward. Just like the Daniel Bryans and the Seth Rollins and the Kevin Owens and the Fergal Devitts and all of them were the stars of the future when they were in those smaller promotions. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. If you watched all of this, thank you very much, and wrestling rules.